The Nazi Occult Files. What they found, deep in the Arctic ice, was Hitler chasing more than just power? What did they uncover that was never meant to be found? The wind howled across the barren, icy expanse of the Arctic, a sound that seemed to echo for miles in every direction. No life, no movement, just the eerie, cold silence broken only by the gusts that whipped through the frozen air. And yet, deep below the ice, something stirred. Something ancient, something wrong. It was supposed to be an ordinary expedition, just another mission in a remote part of the world, far from the eyes of civilization. But what the team uncovered in the depths of that frozen wasteland would shake the foundations of history itself. But before we dive into what they found, let me ask you this. How far would you go for the truth? And more importantly, what would you be willing to believe if you came face to face with something beyond explanation? In 1943, a Nazi expedition ventured deep into the Arctic. They were searching for something, but not just any ordinary mission. They were after something far more sinister. They weren't just fighting the Allies. They were fighting something they didn't understand, something dark and powerful. And when they returned, they brought more than just stories. You see, not everything the Nazis were after was bound to the realm of reality. Some of their expeditions weren't just about winning the war. They were about uncovering forces far older than any of the civilizations we know. They were after relics, artifacts, and secrets that, to this day, have remained hidden beneath layers of ice and stone. One fateful night, in the coldest depths of the Arctic, they found something. Something that defied everything they'd known. And that's where this story begins. What exactly did the Nazis discover in that remote, frozen land? Could it have been a piece of history that the world wasn't meant to uncover? And why, after all these years, are we still so captivated by the shadows of their findings? Let's take a step back, far from the familiar, and journey together to understand what truly lies beneath the ice. What was hidden in the Arctic, and why are some still trying to unlock its terrible secrets? The chilling truth is this. The discoveries made by that Nazi expedition might not just be part of history. They could be the key to something even darker than we dare to imagine. And they left behind a trail of clues waiting for someone to piece them together. Could this discovery still have the power to change everything we know? To this day, people continue to ask, what did they find? And why is it still buried beneath the ice? The team, a mix of seasoned researchers and scientists, had been in the Arctic for weeks before anything unusual happened. For the most part, their expedition followed the routine of any mission in the most desolate place on Earth. Cold, isolation, and long, dark nights. But when they uncovered the first signs, the atmosphere shifted. It was subtle at first, almost unnoticeable, like a shadow creeping across the edge of vision. They had been exploring a cavern system hidden beneath the ice, far deeper than anyone had anticipated. The expedition was meant to be a scientific operation, mapping the terrain, studying the environment, gathering basic data about the region. But the further they descended into the ice, the stranger things began to feel. The first oddity came in the form of a series of strange markings on the cavern walls. Symbols no one recognized, scrawled in what appeared to be a language lost to time. Their texture was unlike anything seen before. Deep, almost carved into the rock, yet smooth, as if the walls themselves had been worn by something more than just natural forces. The researchers chalked it up to some form of ancient human art, or maybe even remnants of earlier civilizations. But something about those markings didn't sit right. They couldn't explain it, but the longer they stared at them, the more they felt a cold sense of dread creep over them. But it wasn't just the markings that unsettled them. It was the faint, almost imperceptible hum that seemed to reverberate from deep within the ice. No one knew where it came from, but it was there. Low, rhythmic, like a pulse. At first, the team thought it was just the wind, the normal creaks and groans of ice shifting under pressure. But there was something different about it. It wasn't a natural sound. Then came the lights. The first time they appeared, it was barely noticeable. A flicker, a strange glow on the horizon. At first, no one said anything. It could have been a reflection of light off the ice, or maybe some other natural phenomenon. But as the lights grew more frequent, it was impossible to ignore. They began to appear in the distance, often at odd times, just as the team was about to call it a day. The lights weren't like any they had seen before. They seemed too controlled, too intentional. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, a series of blue and green orbs began floating just above the snow. They moved, darting in and out of view, as if searching for something. "Is anyone else seeing this?" one of the researchers asked, his voice shaky. The group stood frozen in place, staring at the phenomenon. At first, no one dared move. But as the lights grew brighter, more erratic, one of them spoke again. "Maybe it's just the aurora," he suggested, though his voice lacked conviction. But the aurora wasn't supposed to behave this way. The lights, strange as they were, didn't follow the natural patterns of the aurora borealis. They didn't arc across the sky or shimmer across the horizon. They moved in deliberate patterns, as if something or someone was controlling them. The team tried to dismiss it, but as the days passed, things only got stranger. Equipment started malfunctioning. Radios crackled with static, and instruments that were supposed to be perfectly calibrated began to give inaccurate readings. Then, the team noticed something else. The air was unnaturally cold. It wasn't just the weather. The temperature around them seemed to dip further and further, as if the very earth was growing colder. By now, doubts started creeping into the minds of the crew. They had come expecting harsh conditions, sure, but this felt different. It was on the 6th night, after one of the strange lights had appeared in the sky for the 3rd consecutive night, that they found it. Hidden beneath layers of ice, just beyond the cavern walls, was something that no one could have ever expected to find in the Arctic. A metal object, partially buried but unmistakably out of place in this desolate landscape. At first, the discovery seemed trivial, a simple relic from a forgotten time. The team thought it might be a weathered piece of old machinery, a remnant from a long-past expedition, or even a military relic from World War II. They had seen their share of artifacts from previous missions, and while odd, this didn't immediately raise any alarms. But the closer they got, the more unsettling it became. The metal was unlike anything they had ever encountered, smooth and polished, despite the decades it had spent buried under thick layers of ice. The design was intricate, almost ornate, yet strangely out of place. The markings etched into it seemed to match the ones they'd found inside the cavern. And when they touched it, that's when everything changed. The moment the metal object was uncovered, an intense vibration ran through the ice, causing the ground beneath them to tremble. At first, they thought it was just a result of their digging, but when the vibration continued and intensified, panic began to set in. "Something's not right," one of the team members said, his voice cracking. The hum grew louder, more persistent. It wasn't coming from the object, but from the ground itself, resonating through the ice and into their bones. It was as if the entire region was alive, breathing, waiting. And then, the lights came again. This time they were different. They were no longer small, distant orbs. They were massive, flickering beams of bright light, seemingly focused on their position. The lights moved in strange, erratic patterns, flashing faster and faster as if they were communicating with the object beneath the ice. "What the hell is this?" someone whispered, unable to look away. Suddenly, one of the team members screamed. Everyone turned to see him pointing frantically at the sky, his face ashen. And there, just beyond the horizon, they saw it. The shape was barely visible at first, but as it became clearer, there was no mistaking what it was. A massive, black aircraft, something none of them had ever seen before. It hovered silently, its sleek, dark shape blending into the night sky. The team froze, each one silently questioning whether they were seeing things. It wasn't possible. It couldn't be real. But it was. The aircraft moved with unnerving precision, floating in place as if studying them. The lights from the object beneath the ice seemed to pulse in rhythm with the craft, as if beckoning it closer. This was no ordinary discovery. This wasn't some forgotten relic of an ancient civilization. Whatever they had uncovered was far beyond their understanding. And at that moment, deep in the frozen wilderness, the team realized something terrifying. They weren't the only ones who had found this place. They were not alone. The wind howled across the barren snow, a constant reminder of the isolation, the cold, the endless expanse of nothing. But to Dr. Klaus Richter, it was a sound that now haunted him every waking moment. As one of the few survivors of the ill-fated expedition to the Arctic, he couldn't escape the images that played in his mind. Images of the thing beneath the ice, of the aircraft, of the lights, and of the others who hadn't made it out. Klaus leaned back in his chair, gripping the glass of whiskey in his hand. His eyes, once bright and full of ambition, now held a haunted, far-away look. The memories were too much to carry, and yet they wouldn't leave him. They never would. It had been months since the team's return from the Arctic, but the horrors he'd witnessed still felt fresh, as though they had happened only days ago. The nightmares had come every night, relentless and cruel. They'd begun shortly after the expedition, and now they were a part of his existence. He would never be able to forget. He had been the first to see it clearly. At least, that's how he remembered it. The others had been skeptical when they first arrived, dismissing the strange lights and unnatural occurrences as the product of exhaustion or overactive imaginations. But Klaus knew better. He knew that what they were dealing with wasn't just another anomaly in the far reaches of the Earth. It was something far more dangerous. Something that had been waiting for them, hidden in the ice for centuries. The days that followed their discovery had been a blur of confusion and fear. At first, they had tried to rationalize the findings. The object they unearthed was unlike anything they had ever encountered, a bizarre metal relic, pulsing with an energy that couldn't be explained. It was clearly of extraterrestrial origin. But it was what came next that sent the entire team spiraling into chaos. Klaus remembered the moment when they first saw the aircraft. His heart had stopped in his chest, and he wasn't the only one who felt it. He could still hear the screams of his colleagues as they stared at the thing. This massive, black craft that hovered silently above them, watching. It wasn't just a feeling of being observed. It was something deeper, something far more sinister. It was as if the ship knew they were there, and it had come for them. But even that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was what happened when the lights converged on the object buried beneath the ice. They had all been frozen, paralyzed by the intensity of the moment. The lights flickered, pulsed, and then something deep inside the ice responded. It was as though the object was calling out to the craft, as though it recognized it. It was in that instant that everything changed. The earth beneath them groaned and shifted, as if some ancient force had been awakened from its long slumber. The ground trembled, and Klaus could feel the hair on the back of his neck stand on end. It wasn't just a physical sensation, it was something far darker, something that reached deep into his core. One of the team members, a young scientist named Olivia, was the first to fall victim to whatever had been awakened. She had approached the metal relic, reaching out to touch it. Klaus had called out to her, but it was too late. She screamed, her voice filled with terror, before she collapsed to the ground, her body twitching violently. The others rushed to her side, but by the time they reached her, she was gone. Olivia wasn't dead. At least, not in the way they understood death. She had changed. Her eyes were wide open, staring unblinking into the void, but there was no recognition in them. She was no longer the same person. Klaus had never seen anything like it. She didn't speak. She didn't react. She just existed. The team had been paralyzed by fear. They didn't know what to do. They didn't know how to help her. But then came something even worse, something more terrifying than anything they had encountered so far. The lights in the sky grew brighter, and the hum beneath the ice intensified, vibrating through the ground. The air seemed to thicken, and every breath felt like an effort. It was as if the world itself was closing in around them. And then, they heard it. The voice. It wasn't a sound they could describe. It wasn't language, not as they knew it. It was more like a presence, a deep, resonant hum that seemed to speak directly into their minds. They couldn't understand the words, but they could feel the meaning. It was an invitation, a warning. That's when the madness began. The lights intensified, and the temperature dropped even further. They had to leave. They knew they had to, but the moment they turned to head back to the safety of their camp, they realized they weren't alone. The ice around them shifted, revealing figures, dark, shadowy forms, emerging from the depths of the frozen ground. They weren't human, not in the way they had ever understood humanity, but they were alive. Klaus couldn't fully remember what happened next. His mind, clouded with fear and confusion, could only hold on to fragments of the event. He remembered running, his legs moving faster than they ever had before, his heart pounding in his chest. He remembered hearing the cries of his colleagues as they were overtaken by the shadows, their bodies dragged into the dark, never to be seen again. And then, he remembered waking up in the snow, alone. The wind whipped through the empty landscape, and the only sound was his own breathing. The ice was silent once again, and the darkness had returned, as though nothing had ever happened. But Klaus knew better. The nightmare wasn't over. It had only just begun. As he sat in the safety of his study, Klaus couldn't help but wonder, what had they truly uncovered in that frozen wasteland? Was it just a relic? Or had they unearthed something much more ancient? Something that had been waiting, dormant for centuries, just beneath the surface of the earth. He knew there were still pieces of the puzzle to uncover. He had survived, yes, but not everyone had. And the things that had happened out there, in the cold, could never be fully explained. There was something out there, deep beneath the ice, that was still calling to him, calling to anyone brave enough or foolish enough to listen. The truth, Klaus realized, was buried beneath the ice, and as long as it remained there, the darkness would never truly be gone. It wasn't long before the team began to fracture under the weight of their discoveries. The tension had always been there, but now it was palpable, hanging in the air like a storm waiting to break. The strange lights continued to flicker in the distance, more erratic now, more insistent. The hum beneath the ice hadn't stopped either. It grew louder, almost unbearable. Yet none of them could find the source. It was as if the very ground they stood on was alive, vibrating with some unknown force. They tried to dismiss it, tried to rationalize it as stress or exhaustion, but deep down, they knew they were dealing with something beyond their understanding. And then, things began to happen. At first, it was small, almost imperceptible. Equipment malfunctioned. Radios crackled and popped with static, throwing out bursts of garbled voices in languages none of them recognized. Instruments that had been calibrated perfectly before their descent now gave readings that were entirely off. The temperature continued to plummet, but that didn't stop them from pushing deeper into the cavern, determined to uncover the mystery they had come all this way to solve. It was one of the more experienced researchers, Dr. Henriksen, who first noticed something wasn't right with their own team. At first, it seemed like just another odd occurrence, but when he noticed Olivia's strange behavior, he knew they were in trouble. Olivia had been one of the first to approach the strange relic, but now something about her seemed different. She had been quiet, withdrawn since the day they uncovered the object. But it was more than that. She seemed to be looking past them, as if she was seeing something they couldn't. She'd mumble to herself, her words barely audible, always just on the edge of understanding. Sometimes she would stand in a corner, eyes wide, her body frozen in place for hours at a time, as though she was waiting for something. It was late one night when they realized the true extent of the changes. The team had gathered around the campfire, trying to remain warm in the unforgiving cold. As they spoke in hushed tones, recounting the day's findings, Olivia suddenly stood up, her face blank, her eyes unblinking. "Klaus," she said, her voice low, detached. "They're coming." The others froze. They had all heard the rumors, the whispers, about the strange entities, the shadowy figures that had been seen moving across the ice at night, but none of them had dared to say it aloud. Until now. "They've been watching," Olivia continued, her voice flat. "They want us. They need us." Klaus felt a chill run down his spine. He wasn't sure if it was the cold air or the sense of dread creeping over him, but he knew one thing for certain. Olivia wasn't the same person she had been before. Whatever had happened to her when she touched that object, whatever had taken hold of her, was beginning to affect the rest of them. Dr. Henriksen tried to calm her down, but Olivia wasn't listening. She started muttering words under her breath, something that sounded almost like a chant, but the language was unfamiliar, unlike anything they'd encountered. Her gaze was vacant, distant, as if she were no longer present in that place, in that time. It was as though she had become a conduit for something else. And then, as suddenly as she had spoken, Olivia collapsed, crumpling to the ground with a strange, unnatural sound, her body jerking violently. The group rushed to her side, but there was no response. No breath, no pulse. It was as though she had simply ceased to exist. The others stood in stunned silence, unsure of what to do next. Klaus could feel his heart pounding in his chest, but there was no time to mourn. The air grew colder still, and the hum beneath the ice intensified, almost deafening in its pitch. It was then that they heard it. A low, guttural growl coming from somewhere deep beneath the earth. It was so primal, so full of menace, that it shook them to their core. It wasn't an animal's growl, nor the roar of the wind. It was something else entirely. Something unnatural. One by one they turned their eyes to the darkness beyond the campfire, unable to shake the feeling that they were being watched. But when they stepped closer to the edge of the camp, something moved in the shadows. Klaus had no time to react. He was frozen in place, as if the cold air had gripped him in an invisible vice. The others, too, stood motionless, unable to speak, unable to move. And then, there it was, a figure emerging from the ice. At first, it was a silhouette, barely distinguishable in the shadows, But as it stepped into the light, the team recoiled in horror. It wasn't human. The creature stood tall, almost 7 feet, with long, gnarled limbs and a body twisted into unnatural shapes. Its face was hidden by a hood of shadows, but Klaus could see its eyes, cold, empty, and glowing faintly in the darkness. The air around it seemed to distort, shimmering as if reality itself was bending under its presence. Without a word, the creature extended one skeletal hand, pointing directly at Klaus. He felt his heart lurch in his chest, a deep sense of terror flooding his veins. It wasn't just the creature. It was the presence it carried. Something ancient, something dark. But the creature didn't move toward them. Instead, it turned, its long limbs gliding with disturbing grace, and walked slowly back into the darkness. The lights from the craft in the sky flickered one last time, and then it was gone. The team stood frozen, too afraid to speak, too afraid to move. What had they just witnessed? And why had it left them alive? The answer came the following day, but it only deepened the mystery. When they returned to the cavern, the relic was gone. The hole they had uncovered was now sealed tightly, as if the ice had simply swallowed it whole. The metal object was nowhere to be found. And yet they all felt it, the sensation that something had been taken from them, something that was now beyond their reach. But that wasn't the worst part. As the team continued their investigation, they uncovered something far more unsettling. It was a map, an old, weathered document that had been hidden beneath the ice, a map that led to something far more dangerous than they had ever imagined. The markings on the map seemed to correspond to the strange symbols they had seen earlier, and at the center of it all, there was a place where the relic had been taken, a place that no one could reach. The discovery of the map shook the team to their core. It wasn't just a piece of parchment or a simple artifact. It was a link to something far greater, a connection to a past so tangled in mystery that no one could make sense of it. As they studied the map, a chilling realization began to settle over them. They weren't the first to have discovered this place. Someone had been here long before them, and their presence, perhaps their fate, was etched in the ice. Klaus spent hours poring over the map, his mind racing. The symbols, although similar to those they had found on the relic, had a different resonance. They seemed ancient, almost as if they had been carved by hands long since turned to dust. But what struck him the most was the central location marked on the map, the place where the relic had been taken. It was a dark, forbidding location deep within the heart of the Arctic, a place where even the most daring explorers hesitated to tread. It was the site of the Nazi expedition of 1943. Klaus had heard rumors about Nazi expeditions in the Arctic. It wasn't widely discussed, but there had been whispers over the years, rumors of secret operations conducted by the Third Reich in the frozen wilderness. The Nazis had been obsessed with the occult, with ancient knowledge, and many believed they were after more than just weapons and power. They were after something far more dangerous, something that could tilt the balance of war in their favor. But what exactly had they been searching for? The answer was buried in layers of secrecy. The Nazis were known to have conducted numerous expeditions into remote areas, but this particular one had been shrouded in mystery. Few details had emerged, and what had been discovered was left to speculation. But now, as Klaus traced the path of the map, everything began to click into place. The location marked on the map, the place where the object had been hidden, was no accident. It had been deliberately marked by the Nazis. It was as if they had known something about the Arctic, something that had been waiting for centuries. Klaus's mind raced as he pieced together the puzzle. He recalled the stories he had read, stories of Nazi obsession with the occult, and their experiments with supernatural forces. Could it be that they had discovered something ancient, buried deep within the ice? The more he thought about it, the more the pieces fell into place. The Nazis had been looking for a way to harness ancient power, to bend it to their will. But something had gone wrong. Something had awakened in the ice, something beyond their control. Klaus's thoughts were interrupted when one of the other team members, Dr. Schreiber, entered the room, holding a thick, leather-bound journal in his hands. He looked pale, his face drawn with exhaustion. "You need to see this," Schreiber said, his voice low. Klaus followed him to the back of their makeshift command center, where the journal lay open on a table. Schreiber pointed to the page, his finger trembling. The handwriting was old, faded with time, but Klaus could make out the words, "The final ritual has begun. The gate is opening." Klaus's heart skipped a beat. This was it. This was the link to the past, the journal of one of the Nazi officers who had been part of the 1943 expedition. It wasn't just a record of their findings. It was a confession, a warning. The pages that followed described a series of strange occurrences during the expedition. The team had discovered an ancient temple-like structure buried deep beneath the ice, one that didn't belong to any known civilization. The structure, according to the journal, had been in a state of unnatural preservation, its walls covered in the same symbols they had seen earlier. But what terrified the expedition members wasn't just the temple, it was the relic that lay at its center. The officer's journal spoke of a strange, glowing object, a sphere of dark metal that seemed to pulse with an otherworldly energy. According to the journal, this relic had been the focus of their search. But as they attempted to extract it, something had gone wrong. The temperature in the cavern had plummeted, the lights in their camp had flickered and gone out, and the very ground beneath their feet had shifted. But it was the last entry that sent a chill down Klaus's spine. "They are coming. The gate is open. The old ones walk again." The journal ended there, abruptly, as if the writer had been interrupted. No one knew what had happened to the Nazi expedition after that. The records were lost, and the expedition was considered a failure. But Klaus now knew the truth. The Nazis hadn't just stumbled upon the relic. They had opened something, unleashed something, and now, all these years later, that something was still waiting. Klaus felt a wave of nausea wash over him as he realized the gravity of what they had uncovered. The relic was a key to an ancient power that had been sealed away for millennia. The Nazis had known it, and they had tried to harness it. But their failure was only the beginning. The object beneath the ice had been dormant, but now it was stirring again. And this time, it was calling to them. The team gathered around the journal, their faces pale with fear and disbelief. They had always known something was off, something was wrong, but now they understood the true scope of the danger. The discovery they had made wasn't just a relic. It was the catalyst for something much larger, something that could reshape everything they knew about history, and perhaps even reality itself. The past had been unlocked, and the door had been opened. But now, they had to face the consequences. Klaus looked at his team, his mind racing. "We have to go there," he said, his voice steady but full of dread. "We have to find the source. The Nazis were right about one thing. They weren't just searching for power, they were trying to stop something." And with that, the mission took on a new urgency. They weren't just investigating an ancient relic anymore. They were racing against time, racing against something far older than they had ever imagined, and they had no idea how close they were to the brink of something far darker than they could possibly understand. The days after discovering the journal were marked by an eerie silence. The team had been unnervingly quiet, each member consumed by their own thoughts, as they sifted through the chilling revelations that had unfolded before them. The gravity of their findings weighed heavily on everyone, but none of them could deny the pull. The undeniable drive to go deeper, to understand what had been uncovered in the bowels of the earth. Klaus couldn't shake the thought that the Nazi expedition hadn't just stumbled upon something. They had activated it. The relic wasn't just a piece of forgotten history. It was a trigger, a catalyst that had set in motion events that they were only now beginning to comprehend. What had the Nazis uncovered in the ice? What had they awoken? The unease among the team grew palpable. It wasn't just the looming unknown that haunted them. It was the strange occurrences that had begun to intensify. First, there were the lights. The strange, flickering orbs they had seen in the distance had become more frequent, more intense, as though something or someone was watching them. At first, they had dismissed it as a trick of the light or a natural atmospheric phenomenon, but now there was no denying it. The lights were purposeful, deliberate. They weren't random. They were focused on the team. And then there was the hum, the constant, low-frequency vibration that seemed to emanate from the ice itself. It was subtle at first, just a low, almost imperceptible sound, but as the days passed, it grew louder, more intense, until it felt like the very ground beneath their feet was alive. The hum reverberated through their bones, gnawing at their nerves. It was the sound of something ancient stirring, something that had been dormant for far too long. The team tried to focus on their task, scouring the area for more clues, mapping out the terrain, but the pressure of the unknown was beginning to take its toll. Tensions were running high. Arguments had started to break out over minor details. Dr. Schreiber, who had been one of the most skeptical members of the group, had become increasingly agitated, snapping at the others over the smallest things. The pressure was eating at him, pulling at the edges of his sanity. But it wasn't just him. Everyone was starting to crack. It was Olivia, however, who had begun to show the most disturbing signs of change. Ever since the night she had collapsed, something had been different about her. At first, the team had thought it was just shock from the trauma of what they had witnessed. But as the days passed, it became clear that Olivia wasn't the same person who had arrived in the Arctic weeks ago. Her eyes were vacant, her movements jerky and erratic. She had stopped speaking, but when she did, her voice was far too calm, far too detached. One night, Klaus was woken by a loud crash. He scrambled out of his tent, heart pounding, only to find Olivia standing in front of the relic they had uncovered, her hands trembling as she reached out toward it. She hadn't even noticed him approach. Her gaze was fixed, unfocused, staring at the relic as if it were the only thing that existed in the world. The once familiar warmth of her presence had been replaced by an overwhelming coldness, a sense of distance that sent a chill down Klaus's spine. "Olivia?" he called gently, his voice breaking the silence. She turned slowly, her eyes empty and unblinking. There was no recognition in them. No trace of the woman they had once known. Only a blank void that seemed to swallow everything in its path. "They're waiting," she whispered, her voice flat. "They're coming for us. They know we're here." Klaus stepped back, his heart racing. He tried to reach for her, but the moment his hand touched her arm, a sharp, unnatural cold shot through him. He recoiled instinctively, his breath catching in his throat. It was as if the very essence of Olivia had been replaced by something else. Something dark. Something ancient. The hair on the back of his neck stood up as the ice beneath his feet groaned, almost as if responding to her words. The ground trembled, the hum beneath the ice rising in pitch. It wasn't just the wind. It wasn't just their imagination. The earth itself was shifting, responding to something that was buried deep within its core. A scream pierced the silence. Klaus's head whipped around to see Dr. Henriksen, his face contorted in terror. The scientist pointed frantically toward the cavern entrance, his voice breaking. "It's here! It's coming!" The team rushed toward him, but before they could reach the entrance, something horrific happened. A figure emerged from the shadows, moving with an unnatural grace. It was tall, impossibly tall, with elongated limbs that seemed to stretch and bend as it moved. Its skin was dark, almost black, and its eyes glowed faintly, an otherworldly light that seemed to cut through the darkness like a blade. It wasn't human. It wasn't even close. "Run!" Dr. Henriksen shouted, his voice wild with panic. But it was too late. The creature moved toward them with alarming speed, its eyes locking onto Klaus. A cold, suffocating wave of fear washed over him. The air around him seemed to distort, bending as though reality itself was warping under the creature's presence. It was as though time had slowed down. He could feel his heart pounding in his chest, his breath catching in his throat. And then, just as quickly as it had appeared, the creature was gone, vanishing into the shadows, leaving behind only the chilling silence. For a moment, the team stood frozen in place, their minds struggling to comprehend what had just happened. But Klaus could feel it. The presence that had followed them, the dark force that had been waiting beneath the ice, had just revealed itself. And it was not finished with them. The lights in the sky flickered, a pulse of bright energy lighting up the night. It was as if the creature had called to something even more ancient, something far more dangerous. And then, the hum began again, this time louder, more intense. The ice beneath them seemed to crack, deep fissures spreading across the frozen landscape. The ground was shifting, the barrier between their world and something darker growing thinner with each passing moment. Klaus looked at the rest of the team, his voice barely audible above the rising chaos. "We have to leave," he said, his voice trembling with a mixture of fear and resolve. "Now." But deep down, he knew it was too late. There was no escaping this. The forces they had awakened were too powerful, and they were not going to let them leave. The night was still, but the air had never felt heavier. The hum beneath the ice was louder than ever, and though they tried to tell themselves that they had to remain calm, the fear clawed at them from every direction. Klaus couldn't shake the feeling that they were all running out of time, and the chilling truth started to set in. Whatever they had uncovered was not just an ancient artifact or a relic. It was an invitation. And it was becoming clear that they were being drawn toward something far beyond their understanding. The group had gathered around the campfire, but no one spoke. It was as if the weight of the silence pressed in on them, demanding that they face the impossible. They had all seen the creature, the one that had emerged from the shadows, and none of them had words to describe it. No one dared speak of it, afraid that even uttering the thoughts aloud would make it more real. For the first time since their arrival, Klaus saw the fear in the eyes of his colleagues. Dr. Henriksen, usually calm and collected, had become a shell of the man he once was. His hands trembled as he held his cup of coffee, his mind clearly adrift in the same sea of confusion and terror that had claimed them all. Schreiber, too, was no longer the skeptic he had once been. The man who had dismissed their findings as the product of overworked minds now seemed like a shell of a person, staring into the fire with haunted eyes, as though seeking answers from the flames. But Klaus couldn't help but feel that there were no answers to be found. The knowledge they sought had been locked away for a reason. Whatever had been buried under the ice wasn't meant to be unearthed. And yet, they had, against all odds, awoken it. And it was waking up around them. "How do we explain what happened?" Schreiber asked, his voice hollow. He stared at Klaus, desperate for some rational explanation. but Klaus couldn't offer one. No one could. "We can't," Klaus muttered, rubbing his face in exhaustion. "What we're dealing with, it doesn't fit into any theory. No scientific theory, no historical theory. It's something else. Something beyond our understanding." The silence stretched on, heavy and suffocating. Then, Dr. Henriksen spoke, his voice shaky, almost fearful. "Do you think this could be a curse? I mean, look at what we've uncovered. The Nazis, they were after something they shouldn't have touched. What if it was never meant to be found?" Klaus didn't answer immediately. He had thought about it, about the curse idea, about how it seemed to fit. The Nazis had always been obsessed with the occult, with tapping into powers beyond the physical realm. They had spent years searching for artifacts, relics, and knowledge that could give them an edge in the war. Maybe even grant them control over forces that no one should have ever tampered with. Klaus had read about the bizarre rituals they had attempted to unlock otherworldly powers, and now, with the lights in the sky and the creature they had seen, it felt as though they had unleashed the very thing they had sought. But then again, who was to say? Could it be that it wasn't just the Nazis' curse? Was it something more? Something ancient, predating even them? "This isn't just a curse," Klaus said, his voice barely above a whisper. "This is something older than anything we've ever studied. The Nazis were searching for control, but they found something else. Something that doesn't want to be controlled." "I don't care what it is," Dr. Henriksen snapped, his voice tight with fear. "But I do know this. It's here, it's real, and it's not letting us go. We need to leave. We need to go back." The words hung in the air, but none of them made a move to pack. They had tried to leave before, but the blizzards and the rising temperatures had sealed them in. The Arctic, it seemed, was as much a prison as a place of discovery. They had no way out, not yet. Not until they uncovered more. But the deeper question was, would leaving even matter? The thing beneath the ice wasn't bound by geography. It wasn't confined to the frozen landscape they found it in. It was everywhere, a presence that had reached out, touched them, and left its mark. And the map they had discovered, the one that had led them here, was clear. It wasn't just about this place. The power they had unleashed had a reach far beyond what they had imagined. Klaus turned to Olivia, who had been eerily quiet since their encounter with the creature. Her empty eyes stared into the fire, her body stiff and unmoving. She didn't speak anymore, didn't make any attempt to interact with the others. She had become a vessel of sorts, a strange connection to the force that was slowly taking control of everything around them. "It's here," she said suddenly, her voice chillingly calm. "And it's not just in the ice, it's in all of us now." Her words sent a shiver down Klaus's spine. He had been afraid of this. There had been signs, things he had been too scared to acknowledge. But now, hearing Olivia speak the truth, whatever it was that had taken hold of her, whatever it was that had haunted them all, he knew they were too deep to escape. "There's no way out," Klaus said softly, his eyes narrowing. "Whatever they awakened, it's already been set in motion. The gates have been opened." Schreiber shook his head. "We can't just give up. We're scientists. We came here to understand, to learn." But Klaus shook his head. "It's not about understanding anymore. It's about survival. They didn't just open the gate. They invited it in. The force we're dealing with isn't something that can be understood with our knowledge or our theories. It's beyond us." The team fell silent, their faces filled with dread. Theories had always been a way to explain the unknown. But now, Klaus realized, they were no longer dealing with a mystery that could be solved. They were facing something far darker, an ancient power that had no intention of being understood. "Is it too late?" Henriksen asked, his voice small, almost desperate. Klaus didn't answer right away. The truth was he wasn't sure, but deep in his gut he felt the answer. It was too late for them. They had already been marked. The presence beneath the ice, the one that had waited so long to be awakened, was not going to let them go. Not now. Not ever. The lights flickered again, this time brighter, pulsing in sync with the hum beneath the ice. The air felt thick, charged with energy, as if something immense was pushing through the veil of reality. "We need to find the source," Klaus finally said, his voice resolute, "before it finds us." But the words were hollow. There was no escaping it now. The doors had opened. The darkness was already inside. The decision was made. They had no choice but to venture deeper, to find the source of the ominous power they had awoken. The team had no real plan, no clear strategy, only the instinctual knowledge that they had to act before things got worse. They couldn't leave without answers. The terror, the unknown, gnawed at them, and the only thing that seemed to offer even a fleeting sense of control was going straight to the heart of the mystery. But there was no doubt in anyone's mind. What lay ahead wasn't just another expedition. This was something far more dangerous. Klaus led the group through the snow, their breath forming visible clouds in the bitter air. The ground beneath their feet cracked and groaned with every step, as if the ice itself was protesting their intrusion. But despite the freezing cold, they pressed on, driven by the same fear that had settled like a weight on their chests. Every now and then, they would stop and glance back at the camp, at the thin plume of smoke rising from the fire they had left behind. But the pull to continue forward was overpowering. There was no turning back. As they descended deeper into the cavern system, the air grew colder still. The walls seemed to close in on them, the narrow corridors of ice making them feel like they were walking through some ancient, forgotten temple. The faint hum of the power beneath the ice reverberated through their bones, louder now than it had ever been before. It wasn't just a vibration. It was a living, breathing presence, pressing against them from all sides. Olivia had remained eerily silent throughout the journey, her eyes still vacant, her body stiff with some unseen force. Her presence was unsettling, but Klaus couldn't bring himself to ask her what she had seen or felt. It was clear that she had become a conduit for something far beyond their comprehension, and he wasn't sure if it was something they should try to understand. The deeper they went, the stranger the surroundings became. Strange, unidentifiable markings lined the walls, and the air was thick with the stench of something old, ancient. There was a sense of something alive beneath their feet, something that had been undisturbed for centuries. Every corner they turned, every tunnel they entered, seemed to lead them further into the heart of this frozen world. And with each step, the intensity of the hum grew, until it felt like the very ice beneath their boots was shaking with anticipation. "Are we sure this is the right place?" Dr. Henriksen asked, his voice shaky. Klaus glanced over his shoulder, his eyes narrowed. "There's no turning back now. We've come this far. We have to know what it is." Henriksen nodded, though his face was drawn with fear. He had once been the most skeptical of them all, and now that skepticism had been replaced with an all-consuming dread. It was clear that none of them were prepared for what they had uncovered. They had only scratched the surface, and now the truth was spiraling out of control. As they rounded another corner in the labyrinth of tunnels, they found it. The chamber was massive, the walls stretching high into the darkness. At the center, suspended in the middle of the room, was the object, the relic. It was far larger than any of them had imagined, a dark, spherical shape that pulsed with an eerie, otherworldly glow. Its surface was smooth, almost metallic, and it seemed to shimmer in the dim light of their torches, casting long shadows on the ice. It was as if the relic had become a living thing, breathing and waiting. Klaus felt his stomach churn. This was it, the source, the very thing that had called them here. And yet standing before it, he felt an overwhelming sense of dread. It wasn't just a relic, it was a doorway, a gateway to something far older than their minds could comprehend. Something that had been waiting, hidden in the ice for millennia. Olivia stepped forward, her gaze fixed on the relic. There was no hesitation in her movements. It was as if she had been drawn to it, pulled by some invisible force. "No, Olivia," Klaus said, his voice firm as he reached for her arm. But she ignored him. She continued to walk towards the object, her movements mechanical, like a puppet on strings. She was already too far gone, lost to whatever dark force had taken hold of her. "It's time," she whispered, her voice distant, as if she were speaking to someone or something else. "They're here." The air grew heavier, charged with an energy that made the hair on Klaus's neck stand on end. He could feel it, the weight of something terrible looming just beyond the veil of reality. The lights outside flickered, casting strange shadows across the ice. He turned, his heart racing as the ground beneath them began to tremble. "We have to get out of here," Dr. Henriksen said, his voice panicked. But before they could even react, the chamber seemed to come alive. The relic emitted a low, guttural hum, and the walls of the cavern shuddered as though something was stirring beneath them. The ground cracked open, deep fissures running through the ice, and a deep, rumbling sound echoed from the depths of the earth. Klaus's heart sank as he realized what was happening. The relic was opening. Its power was growing stronger with every passing second. The chamber was no longer a place of discovery. It was a trap, a prison from which there would be no escape. Suddenly, the lights in the sky outside flared bright, casting an unnatural glow through the cracks in the ice. But it wasn't just light. It was energy. Raw, unfiltered, and suffocating. The walls of the cavern began to bend and warp, as though reality itself was being distorted. "It's too late," Klaus whispered to himself, his voice heavy with dread. Olivia, still standing before the relic, turned slowly, her face twisted in an expression of sheer terror. Her eyes, those empty, vacant eyes, were filled with a new emotion. Fear. But it wasn't her fear alone. It was the fear of something far older, far darker. The creature from earlier, the one they had seen only in fleeting shadows, emerged from the darkness once again, its glowing eyes locking on to Klaus. It moved slowly, its limbs stretching unnaturally, as if it were testing the limits of reality itself. The air thickened, and the ground continued to rumble as the entity approached. Klaus felt a pressure building in his chest, a feeling of impending doom that was suffocating. The hum beneath the ice, the crackling energy, it was all leading to this moment. And in that moment, Klaus realized the truth. They weren't just dealing with an ancient artifact or an occult ritual. They were facing an ancient, unfathomable power, a force that had been sealed away for reasons they could never understand. They had come for answers. But what they had awakened wasn't just history. It was the end. The air in the cavern had become thick, a living, pulsing force pressing in on them from all sides. The walls of the chamber seemed to bend under the weight of the energy emanating from the relic, warping reality itself. Every breath Klaus took felt like a struggle, the air around him heavy, thick with tension. The creature, no, thing, stood before them now, its glowing eyes piercing through the darkness with an intensity that burned into their souls. It wasn't just an apparition. It was alive. And it was waiting. Olivia stood frozen, still gazing at the relic as if hypnotized, her movements eerily calm, her once human features were now pale, her expression distant, as if she were somewhere else entirely. Klaus could feel the coldness radiating from her, something far beyond the temperature of the cavern. She wasn't herself? Not anymore. The rest of the team had backed away, their faces pale with fear, their minds struggling to process what was happening. Dr. Henriksen, who had once been the most rational, had his eyes wide, hands trembling as he fumbled for his equipment. But he knew, just as Klaus knew, that it was too late. The moment they uncovered the relic, the moment they had disturbed the power buried beneath the ice, there was no going back. Klaus tried to step forward, but the weight of the air, the pressure of the energy, made it feel like he was wading through concrete. His legs felt like lead, and with every step, the hum grew louder, more intense, vibrating deep within his chest. He gritted his teeth and fought the urge to turn back. There was no escape. Not now. "Olivia!" Klaus shouted, his voice cracking with desperation. "You have to fight it! You have to come back!" But she didn't respond. Her eyes remained fixed on the relic, her lips parted as if she were speaking, but no sound emerged. It was as if the very act of speaking was beyond her now. She was lost to whatever dark power had taken hold of her. Then, the entity, it moved. Slowly, deliberately, like a predator savoring its meal. Its limbs stretched unnaturally, a fluid, grotesque motion that defied physics, each movement more disturbing than the last. The shadows in the cavern seemed to grow darker around it, as if the creature itself was pulling the light from the room. It took a step forward, its eyes never leaving Klaus, its presence filling the cavern with an oppressive weight. Klaus could feel it then, the connection. The creature, this entity, wasn't just an apparition. It wasn't just an ancient spirit or some lost myth. It was something far older, something that had existed long before human history. It was part of the land itself, a being that had once ruled this place, buried beneath the ice for reasons they could never understand. And now, they had awakened it. The hum grew louder, vibrating through their bones, and Klaus could hear a faint whispering in his ears, like voices lost in time. The language was foreign, impossible to understand, but the intent was clear. It was calling to him, to all of them. Suddenly the ground beneath them trembled violently, the ice cracking as though the very earth itself was protesting their presence. The lights outside flickered again, brighter this time, as if reacting to the shift in the energy below. The relic, now fully activated, seemed to pulse with power, sending waves of unnatural light rippling across the cavern walls. It was as if the relic itself was feeding off the chaos, growing stronger with every passing second. "Move!" Klaus shouted, instinctively, pulling at Dr. Henriksen's arm. The team began to retreat, but the creature didn't allow them the chance to escape. It lunged forward, its long, gnarled limbs reaching out with terrifying speed. The air around them snapped with a crackling energy, and before anyone could react, it was there, standing directly in front of Klaus, blocking their path. The creature's eyes, those cold, glowing eyes, locked onto Klaus. A deep, resonant growl rumbled from deep within its chest, a sound so primal that it shook the very foundations of the cavern. Klaus felt the pressure build in his chest, the air suffocating him. It wasn't just fear, it was the weight of something ancient, something that knew him. It was as if the creature could see into his very soul. It stepped closer, and Klaus instinctively backed away, his heart pounding. Every cell in his body screamed at him to run, to escape, but his legs refused to move. The creature's gaze held him in place, an invisible force locking him to the spot. He was paralyzed, unable to tear his eyes away from the entity, and he realized in that moment that it wasn't just his body that was trapped. it was his mind, too. The creature tilted its head slightly, studying him, its eyes narrowing as if it were trying to decipher something. And then it spoke, not in words, not in language, but in thoughts. "You shouldn't have come." Klaus's mind reeled. It wasn't possible. He hadn't heard anything. He hadn't seen the creature's mouth move. But the words were in his head, clear as day, reverberating through his skull like a storm. He could feel the cold tendrils of its presence burrowing into his consciousness. "We waited for so long. You broke the seal. You set us free." The creature's words were not just an accusation, they were a warning, a declaration. They had done something irreversible. The seal, the relic, it had been designed to keep something locked away, and they had broken it open. The ground cracked again, louder this time, as if the earth itself was splitting apart. A deep rumble echoed from beneath the ice, and the walls of the cavern began to shift. The creature's gaze remained fixed on Klaus, the weight of its presence growing heavier with every passing second. And then, as if in response to its call, the air shifted again. Something began to emerge from the shadows, a figure cloaked in darkness, moving with unnatural speed. It was more than one. Dozens of them. Other entities, others like the first one, began to manifest from the dark corners of the cavern, moving closer, their eyes glowing, their forms shifting, rippling like smoke in the air. They were all around them now, closing in, encircling them in the ever-tightening grip of their power. Klaus could feel the weight of their gaze, the pressure building as the room grew colder. The hum was now deafening, overwhelming. His thoughts were clouded, consumed by an impossible dread that was suffocating him. He couldn't think. He couldn't breathe. "We need to run!" Dr. Henriksen shouted, his voice breaking through the chaos. But it was too late. The ground beneath their feet split open again, a deep fissure running through the ice, and before anyone could react, a blinding flash of light filled the cavern, and everything went dark. The world was consumed by darkness. Klaus's heart raced, his mind reeling from the blinding flash that had torn through the cavern. For a moment, there was nothing but the deafening silence that followed, broken only by the distant rumblings beneath the ice. His body felt like it had been hollowed out, drained of all sensation, and as his eyes adjusted to the lingering darkness, he realized with a sickening jolt that they were no longer in the same place. The cavern, what was left of it, had changed. The ice that had once been firm and unyielding now seemed to shimmer with an unnatural light, as though it were breathing. The air was thick, charged with an energy that made every nerve in Klaus's body stand on end. The pressure that had suffocated them moments ago was now a tangible weight, as if the very atmosphere was pushing them into the ground. Klaus staggered to his feet, his head spinning. Where were the others? Where was everyone? He could hear movement around him, hushed, frantic whispers. The team had scattered, some still frozen in terror, others trying to regain their bearings, but Klaus couldn't see anyone clearly. All he could hear were the unsettling noises reverberating around them, a low, almost imperceptible hum that filled the air, like the sound of something stirring in the depths of the earth. And then, in the distance, the faint echoes of something far darker. "It's too late." The voice wasn't in his head. It was real, raw, guttural, and impossible to ignore. Klaus spun around, his breath catching in his throat. The creature. It was standing in front of him, its glowing eyes fixed on him once again. The same presence, the same weight. But now it was joined by others, dozens of dark figures, their forms shifting in and out of focus, their eyes glowing with the same sickly light. They circled around him, moving as one, an endless sea of darkness closing in. Their limbs twisted unnaturally, their bodies impossibly tall, far beyond the realm of what any human could have conceived. The entity closest to Klaus stepped forward. It didn't speak. It didn't need to. The message was conveyed through a sickening sense of dread that washed over him in waves. It was a presence, not bound by the physical realm, but something far older, far more primal. You can't escape. You won't escape. Klaus felt his knees buckle, his body trembling with the force of the creature's gaze. His mind screamed at him to run, to do anything, but every part of him felt paralyzed. The cold was now suffocating, seeping deep into his bones. He could feel the air growing heavier with every passing moment, each breath more labored than the last. His fingers were numb, his limbs stiff, as if the very atmosphere was freezing him from the inside out. And then, in the midst of the terror, he heard it. A voice, familiar, echoing in the distance. Klaus, it was Dr. Henriksen. His voice was shaking, but there was an edge of desperation to it that pierced through the thick, oppressive air. Klaus's eyes darted to where the voice had come from, but he couldn't see anything in the near pitch-black cavern. "Henriksen!" Klaus shouted, his voice cracking. Another voice cut through the dark. Olivia's. Her voice was hollow, like a ghost speaking through a long-forgotten echo. "They're coming. You opened the gate." The words hung in the air, their meaning impossible to escape. Klaus's chest tightened. Who were they? What had they unleashed? He stumbled forward, trying to find his way in the dark, but the light was growing dimmer. Whatever energy had been in the chamber was now being absorbed by something, or someone, beneath the ice. He could feel it, the pressure, the power. Something was rising. As if on cue, the walls of the cavern began to shift again, the ice fracturing and splitting open in multiple places. The rumbling grew louder, shaking the ground beneath their feet as deep fissures spread, revealing what lay beneath. And what emerged wasn't just an ancient power, it was a force of destruction. Figures, massive, spectral beings, emerged from the cracks, towering over them like shadows of a forgotten age. They moved with a disturbing grace, stepping through the ice as though it were nothing more than air. Their faces, obscured by shadows, held a terrifying calm, and their bodies seemed to twist and distort, bending the very laws of reality. Klaus's heart pounded in his chest, his mind trying to make sense of what was happening, but it was futile. The truth was too vast, too incomprehensible to grasp. The beings before them weren't ghosts, they weren't spirits, they were something much older, something bound to this place, to the ice, to the land itself. They were the ancient guardians, and they were waking up. One of them stepped forward, its eyes glowing with an ethereal light. It looked directly at Klaus, and for a moment he thought he saw a flicker of recognition, something ancient, something that remembered. A low, resonating voice filled the air, not spoken but felt deep inside his mind. "You have trespassed, human. You have awakened what should have remained buried." Klaus's knees nearly gave way beneath him. The pressure of the entity's gaze was unbearable. It wasn't just a warning. It was an accusation. And Klaus realized in that moment that everything they had uncovered, the relic, the map, the strange markings on the walls, had been a test. The Nazi expedition. The strange occurrences, even their own arrival. It had all been part of a cycle that had been set in motion long ago, and now they had played their part. The creature's voice was a low growl that seemed to vibrate through every part of Klaus's body. "You are the final link. The ritual is almost complete." A burst of light, sickly, green, erupted from the fissures in the ice, and Klaus found himself thrown to the ground by the force of the explosion. The world spun around him as the ground cracked wide open, and he heard screams, though he wasn't sure if they were his or someone else's. Through the haze, he saw figures, the shadowy entities, dissolving into the light, their forms shifting, merging with the power rising from the depths. The ice cracked apart, and in the center of it all, the relic pulsed again, sending out waves of energy that reverberated through the cavern. And in the center of it all, Klaus knew that they were not merely facing death. They were facing a rebirth. A dark, primal force had returned, and it was coming for them all. Klaus felt the ground shake beneath him as the energy from the relic coursed through the cavern. The ice around them trembled, splitting further as jagged edges shot upward, creating a labyrinth of frozen columns. The air was thick, suffocating, and the humming beneath the ice was so loud now that it felt as though the very earth itself was about to tear open. Everything seemed to collapse inward, pulling Klaus into the chaos that had only just begun. Amidst the violent upheaval, a cold, oppressive silence fell over them. Klaus, his chest heaving, struggled to breathe as he pulled himself up, his vision blurry from the disorienting flash of energy that had ripped through the chamber. His heart pounded, each beat resonating in his ears, louder than the tremors around him. Through the haze, he caught sight of Olivia, standing motionless, her face eerily still, as if she had become one with the ice. Her eyes, once vacant, now glowed faintly, translucent, alien. She wasn't alive in the way he remembered. And then, as if compelled by some force he couldn't comprehend, he saw it. The final clue. In the center of the cavern, where the relic pulsed with energy, a thick shard of ancient stone jutted from the ice. It wasn't a part of the cavern. It had been placed there. A perfect rectangular block, covered with intricate markings. The same symbols they had seen before, etched into the walls of the cavern, on the relic and the journal. But this stone, this shard, was different. It radiated a faint but palpable energy, one that seemed to call to Klaus. Without thinking, he stumbled toward it, his hands shaking. The figure of the entity, the one that had first appeared to them, the tall, shadowy being, was still standing, observing him. The creatures that had risen from the depths were circling, their glowing eyes fixed on him as if waiting for something to happen. Klaus reached out and touched the stone. The instant his fingers made contact with it, the cavern around him seemed to hold its breath. The pressure intensified, the hum from below growing louder still, but something changed. The symbols on the stone seemed to shift and come alive beneath his touch, glowing faintly in a rhythm that matched the pulsing of the relic. For a brief moment, Klaus understood. It wasn't just a clue, it was a key to the door that had been sealed shut for millennia. The Nazis hadn't just stumbled upon it, they had unlocked it. The relic, the markings, the stone, these were all part of an ancient ritual, a ritual designed to open the gates that had held the old ones, the entities, at bay for so long. The object they had uncovered was a part of a much larger mechanism, a device that had been activated by their presence, and in doing so, they had brought the world closer to destruction. The stone, however, held the last part, the final piece of the puzzle. Klaus's hands trembled as the stone warmed under his fingers. He could feel something shifting in the air, like a shift in gravity, as though the universe itself was bending to the will of whatever ancient force controlled this place. The connection between the stone and the relic was undeniable. But what happens when the final piece is put into place? Klaus's mind raced. The realization hit him like a wave. He had to stop it. If he didn't, everything they had seen, everything they feared would be unleashed. The stone didn't just hold power, it was the catalyst. It was the final activation, and the relic beneath the ice, The strange forces they had witnessed were not meant to remain hidden. The relic had been waiting, dormant, until the right moment had come. Now, with the stone in place, the ritual was nearing completion. The creature in front of him shifted, its limbs moving with unnatural fluidity, its form rippling in and out of focus, and Klaus felt his breath catch in his throat. The being didn't speak, but in his mind, he could hear it clearly. "You have unlocked the door. You will join us soon." Klaus backed away, a sudden sharp fear gripping him. The stone was glowing brighter now, and the relic seemed to hum louder, as if acknowledging the final act. The creatures circling them grew still, their eerie, glowing eyes fixed on the object with an almost reverent intensity. Olivia, still standing unmoving by the relic, began to speak, her voice unnaturally deep. "The final stage. The gate is open. You have no choice but to follow the path." Her words hit him like a blow. The entities had been dormant for so long, waiting for the right moment, the right key. Klaus realized with horror that they had unwittingly followed that path. They had been pawns in a much older game, and now they were too far gone to stop it. A horrible thought crossed Klaus's mind. If the gate opened, could they ever close it again? The hum of the relic grew louder. The temperature in the cavern dropped drastically, causing the ice to crack and splinter violently. Klaus felt the hairs on his neck stand on end. The air was alive, filled with a force so old, so powerful, that even his thoughts felt distorted, warped by the pressure of its presence. His body trembled uncontrollably, as if the very fabric of reality itself was beginning to fray. A deep, resonating sound echoed through the ice. The fissures in the cavern expanded, revealing a swirling, glowing mass beneath the ice, shifting and twisting like something that couldn't be fully perceived by human eyes. It was a maelstrom of energy, power, and darkness, pulling at everything around it. The entities in the cavern gathered around it, their forms blurring, merging with the growing force beneath them. Klaus could see it now. They weren't simply beings. They were conduits, drawn into the power of the relic. In a moment of clarity, Klaus realized what needed to be done. "We have to destroy it," he whispered urgently to Henriksen and the others, though it was clear they had already realized the same thing. But how? How could they possibly destroy something that ancient, that powerful, when it had been waiting, dormant, for so long? Klaus's hands shook as he reached for the stone again, the final piece of the puzzle still in his palm. But something wasn't right. As soon as his fingers touched it, the relic pulsed violently, sending a wave of energy surging through his body. He screamed out in pain as the force overtook him, and for a split second, everything stopped. And then, in the brief silence, Klaus understood. The final clue wasn't just to stop the ritual. The final clue was to accept the consequences of what they had awakened. The question remained: would they survive it? Klaus's vision blurred as the surge of energy coursed through him. The stone in his hand felt impossibly hot, as though it were alive, pulsing with an ancient, malevolent force. His body trembled under the intensity of it, and the ground beneath his feet seemed to shift and crack, as though the very fabric of reality was coming undone. The relic, the door, was opening wider now, and the creatures circling around him became even more agitated, their glowing eyes flaring brighter, their forms shifting and twisting in the dark. Klaus tried to focus, tried to shake off the overwhelming sensation that threatened to swallow him whole, but it was useless. He couldn't think straight. The energy was too powerful. It was suffocating him, drowning him in a sea of ancient knowledge, knowledge far beyond what any human was meant to comprehend. And then, in that chaotic swirl of thoughts and energy, a terrifying realization struck him. This wasn't just the first time history had repeated itself. This had been planned, orchestrated, long before any of them had come here. The Nazis, in their desperate search for power, had known more than they had ever let on. They hadn't just been searching for weapons or occult knowledge. They had been looking for the key to open the gates of this ancient, dark force, and in doing so, they had reawakened it. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that they had failed. They hadn't finished the ritual. They had triggered the opening, but they hadn't completed it, leaving the gate ajar. The power left dormant. For decades, it had remained trapped beneath the ice, waiting for the right moment, waiting for someone else to come along and finish the job. And now, Klaus and his team had unwittingly done just that. The weight of his realization hit him like a crushing wave. They weren't simply dealing with a forgotten piece of history. They weren't just fighting against the supernatural or the unknown. They were dealing with a force that had been buried for millennia, a force that had waited patiently for the right time to rise again. The Nazis had been puppets in this ancient game, as much victims of the power they sought to control as they had been the aggressors. The relic, the stone, the markings, they were part of a cycle, a ritual that had been passed down for generations. This was never just about knowledge or power. It was about something much darker. And now that it had been fully awakened, history had repeated itself. The gate was open, the ancient ones were stirring, and there was no going back. As Klaus stood frozen, the air around him thickened, the temperature plummeting even further. The glowing light from the relic intensified, its pulse quickening. The ground beneath him shook violently, and the ice cracked open wider, revealing a swirling, dark abyss beneath. The hum had now become a deafening roar, a sound that reverberated through his body, shaking his very bones. The creatures were no longer circling, they were ascending. They were drawing closer to the surface, merging with the energy pouring from the relic. Klaus looked around frantically for the others, but the chaos was so all-consuming that it was hard to focus on anything other than the monstrous force now building in the center of the cavern. Dr. Henriksen, Schreiber, and the rest of the team were still trying to regain their bearings, but Klaus knew that they were beyond saving. The power that had been unleashed was too great, too uncontrollable. There was only one chance left, one last desperate measure. Klaus gripped the stone harder, its energy searing through his hand. The final piece of the ritual, they had to stop it. But how? A voice in his mind, not his own, whispered urgently, "Sacrifice." The word hit him with the clarity of a thunderclap. His heart skipped a beat. The answer had been there all along, hidden in plain sight. This ritual, this ancient force, didn't simply require the opening of the gate. It demanded a sacrifice. The price for awakening the ancient ones wasn't just knowledge. It was blood. It always had been. The Nazis had failed to realize this, but Klaus and his team hadn't just unlocked the gate. They had fulfilled the ritual. Klaus glanced over at Olivia. Her body was still motionless, her eyes vacant. But now there was something else. The air around her seemed to vibrate. Her connection to the relic, to the power beneath the ice, had become undeniable. She had been the first to fall victim to it, but now Klaus understood. She had become the anchor. She was the vessel that would complete the ritual, the living conduit through which the power would surge. The thought made him sick, but he knew what had to be done. There was no way to stop this without completing the final step. And if he didn't act quickly, the ancient ones would consume everything. The creatures, the relic, the power, they were all part of this cycle. And once the gate was fully open, there would be no turning back. But as Klaus took a step toward Olivia, something unexpected happened. The creature closest to him, the one that had first revealed itself, lunged forward, its glowing eyes locking onto him with an intensity that burned through his very soul. Klaus froze, a wave of terror flooding him. The entity was close enough now that he could feel its presence in his mind, its thoughts invading his own. You cannot stop what is inevitable, human. The door is open. You are part of the cycle now. The words filled his head, and for a moment, Klaus felt the ground beneath him give way. The power of the relic surged again, blinding him with its intensity. The creatures, now fully ascended from the depths, began to merge with the energy from the relic. Their forms flickered and shifted, transforming into something far beyond human understanding. But as they did, Klaus realized with a terrifying clarity, it wasn't just the ancient ones who had returned. It was history itself. The cycle was repeating, and the world was now on the brink of a catastrophic rebirth. The entities in the cavern began to speak, their voices merging into one unearthly chorus, resonating throughout the chamber. The time has come. We return to reclaim what was once ours. Klaus looked one last time at Olivia, her vacant eyes now glowing with a strange, supernatural light. His heart broke as he realized the truth. There was no way to stop it. The power had already claimed them. They had all played their parts in this ancient ritual, and now there was no escaping the consequences. With the realization that history would continue its unending loop, Klaus understood what was truly at stake, not just the survival of his team, but the future of the world itself. The gate was open, and the ancient ones would rise again. The cavern was alive with energy. The air had become so thick with power that it felt like it could be cut with a knife, and the ground beneath Klaus's feet was shifting with every passing moment. The creatures, the ancient ones, had fully emerged from the depths of the ice, their forms writhing and distorting, as if they were not bound by any natural laws. Their eyes, glowing with an unnatural light, fixed on him, their collective presence suffocating him, pressing in on all sides. Klaus could hear their voices now, clearer than ever, not in his ears but deep within his mind, a constant hum, low and resonating, echoing like a chant. They weren't just communicating with him. They were invading his thoughts, pulling him closer into their fold. You are the last to understand. The voice inside his head rumbled, its tone rich and deep, like the sound of an ancient bell tolling. The gate is open. You have come to fulfill your place. Your time is over. Klaus's heart raced as the weight of the words settled on him. There was no escape, no way to fight back. The ritual had been set in motion long before they had ever arrived, and he had been helpless in its grasp. They had completed it. He had completed it. Now the consequences were unfolding in front of him. Olivia stood motionless in front of the relic, her body glowing faintly as the energy from the ice poured into her. Her vacant eyes were now completely filled with the ancient power, her entire being a conduit for the creature's return. She wasn't human anymore, not in any sense Klaus understood. She had become a vessel for the dark force they had unwittingly unleashed. She was the anchor they needed to bring the ritual to its climax. But that wasn't enough. Klaus's mind swirled with the understanding that the creatures, these ancient beings, had never just been waiting for an opportunity. They had been waiting for a vessel. Olivia had been marked the moment she touched the relic. She had been the chosen one, the one to bridge the gap between their world and this one. But there was still something missing, something the creatures needed to complete their full return. Sacrifice, the voice murmured again, this time much closer. Klaus turned toward the source of the sound, his eyes widening in horror. The creature, the one that had first appeared before them, was standing in front of him now, towering over him like a shadow that blocked out the light. Its glowing eyes bored into Klaus's soul, its expression unreadable, though Klaus could feel the malice radiating from it. "You are the final piece. You will complete the cycle." The voice was so powerful, so omnipotent, that Klaus could feel it in every fiber of his being. The ground beneath them cracked, deep fissures running through the ice. The light from the relic pulsed more violently now, and the cavern seemed to collapse inward, the very air twisting around them as if it were alive. The creatures had already begun to ascend higher, their bodies fading into the energy, becoming part of the ritual that had been waiting for centuries. Klaus could feel the inevitability of it all. There was only one way to stop this, but at what cost? The Ancient Ones needed a final sacrifice to complete their rebirth. They needed a life. His life. Klaus knew it instinctively now. It was the only way to sever the connection, to prevent them from fully rising. But even as the thought crossed his mind, he felt the cold hand of despair settle into his chest. Could he really make that sacrifice? Could he truly give himself up to stop this nightmare? It was then that he realized the most chilling truth. He didn't have a choice. The creature before him stretched out a hand, and as it did, the air around Klaus grew cold, unnaturally cold. He could feel the ice creeping into his very bones, draining his warmth, his strength. It was as if the creature was pulling the life from him, feeding on his very essence. And then, just as Klaus was about to collapse under the weight of the energy, he saw something unexpected. A flash of light, a flare of energy, pierced through the darkness. It wasn't from the relic. It wasn't from the creatures. It was coming from Olivia. Her body convulsed as the energy that had been coursing through her began to shift. The light in her eyes dimmed, her form flickering, as if it were fighting against something. A ripple passed through the air, and for a split second, Klaus felt something break. The connection between Olivia and the ancient power faltered. For the first time, Olivia spoke. Her voice was soft, almost a whisper, but it pierced the tension like a blade. "You have to end it," she said, her voice tremulous, barely a whisper. Her eyes flickered with brief moments of clarity, moments that seemed to belong to the woman she had once been. Klaus's heart skipped a beat. This was the moment. This was his chance to make things right. But how? The voice in his mind thundered once again, drowning out all other thoughts. "It is too late. You cannot stop what you have already begun." Klaus turned to Olivia, desperate to act. He reached out to her, and for the first time she seemed to respond, her hand weakly reaching for his. "Do it," she whispered again, her voice steadying, even as the energy around them intensified. "You have to close the gate. You have to sacrifice yourself to stop them." The creatures, sensing the shift, grew agitated, their glowing eyes now burning with fury. Klaus could feel the force of their power pressing against him, trying to break him, to drag him into the abyss. "No escape," they whispered in unison. But then, Klaus did the only thing he could think to do. He closed his eyes, taking a deep breath, and he made the decision that would change everything. With one final surge of strength, he reached out and grabbed the relic. The pulse of energy coursed through him, burning him from the inside out. The pain was excruciating, unbearable, but Klaus held on. He felt the ancient power consume him, the creatures' voices, screaming in his head. And then, in that moment, he did the unthinkable. He let go. In an instant, the energy around him shattered, splintering in every direction. The creatures screamed, their forms dissolving into the ether as the very fabric of the cavern collapsed. The light from the relic flickered, dimming as the energy began to fade. Klaus felt his body give out, the strength leaving him, his mind slipping into the dark abyss. But as everything around him began to disintegrate, he felt one thing: peace. The gate had closed, The Ancient Ones were sealed away once more, and he had sacrificed himself to do it. The world around Klaus was crumbling, the once solid ice of the cavern now shattered like glass, splintering into jagged shards that cascaded into the void below. The very foundation of the earth seemed to be breaking apart as the relic, the creatures, and the ancient power that had surged through them all were being sucked back into the depths. Klaus could feel his body weakening, his consciousness slipping away. But there was something else, too. A presence, one that seemed to linger in the fractured air, a pull, faint but undeniable, that tugged at his fading mind. The calm he had felt just moments ago, the peace in sacrificing himself, was suddenly replaced by a disturbing sense of unease. Klaus tried to open his eyes, but the light around him was dimming. He could still hear the echoes of the creature's screams, distorted and muffled, as if they were being drawn back into the ice. He felt the coldness of the cavern consume him, and for a brief moment he thought it was over. The gate had closed. The ritual had been completed. The Ancient Ones had been sealed away. But then he realized something. The silence was too still. The oppressive weight of the cavern's energy had lifted, but in its place, something else lingered. Something wrong. Klaus's vision began to blur again, but he was no longer in the cavern. His body felt weightless, floating in an expanse of endless darkness. The icy cold was gone, replaced by an eerie warmth. He could hear nothing now, only the faintest whisper in the back of his mind. It was then that he saw it. At first, a shadow in the distance, a flicker of light, subtle and impossible to ignore. It was like a silhouette against the blackness, an outline that shouldn't be there. Klaus strained to focus, his mind struggling to make sense of the sight. The figure was tall, impossibly tall, and its form was shrouded in darkness, save for the faint glow of its eyes. And then it spoke. "Did you think it was that easy?" Klaus's heart raced. The voice was deep, resonant, and unmistakably otherworldly. It was the same voice he had heard in his mind, in the depths of the cavern. The voice of the creature that had watched him, that had guided him through the chaos. But this wasn't the creature he had known. This was something more, something darker. "You have done well, Klaus Richter," the voice continued, its tone eerily calm. "But you have made a grave mistake. You think the ritual is complete. You think you have closed the gate." Klaus tried to speak, to protest, but his mouth wouldn't move. His thoughts were sluggish, disjointed. He didn't understand. The gate had been closed. The creatures had been sealed away. He had sacrificed himself for that purpose. What more could there possibly be? The figure before him shifted, moving toward him with unnerving grace. It was close now, so close that Klaus could feel its presence pressing against him, filling his mind with a sense of dread unlike anything he had ever felt before. "You did not close the gate, Klaus," the voice whispered, its tone growing darker. "You only thought you closed it. The true door remains open, and you have given us what we need to enter this world again." Klaus's heart skipped a beat. The dread that had settled in his chest intensified, and his mind screamed for clarity. What was happening? What had he done? The figure moved closer, its form now impossibly vast, filling the darkness. Klaus could feel the energy emanating from it, like a storm on the horizon, something ancient and malevolent. The creature's eyes glowed brighter, burning through the very fabric of his mind. "You are nothing but a pawn in the game, Klaus. You always were." A sick realization hit him like a crushing blow. Klaus had not stopped the ritual. He had only delayed it. The gate had not been closed. The entities he had fought to seal away were merely the vanguard, the first wave of something far greater. The creature before him, this being of ancient darkness, was not just a guardian of the relic. It was the true architect of the ritual. It had been orchestrating everything all along, guiding him to this moment. He had thought he was the one to stop it. But the truth was far worse. The creature had let him stop the initial ritual. It had allowed him to think he had closed the gate. All the time, the Ancient Ones had been waiting for him to open it fully. Klaus's body shuddered with the weight of this realization. He had become the final piece in their plan, the one who would release them fully into the world. The ancient power had been waiting for this moment, waiting for him to come to the realization that the gate was never truly sealed, because it had never needed to be. It had only needed him. You are the sacrifice, Klaus. The price to open the door to our true return, the voice continued, its tone dripping with disdain. And now, you will watch as we step through. The world around Klaus began to twist. The darkness was replaced by flashes of blinding light, colors that seemed to bleed into one another, impossible to comprehend. The cavern, the ice, the relic, they were gone. In their place was a vast, endless expanse, filled with shapes and shadows beyond his ability to understand. And then, as if in response to the creature's call, the ground beneath him began to shift, forming into something else, another world. The Ancient Ones, their forms swirling into this reality, their true forms, massive, towering, and incomprehensible, began to materialize around him. They were not bound by the ice anymore. They were stepping through the door. Klaus realized in his final, lucid moments that he had not saved the world. He had only brought it closer to its destruction. The ancient beings were now free to walk the earth, and with them, they would bring an age of darkness, an age where humanity would be nothing more than a forgotten footnote. And as the last of his strength drained away, as the dark energy filled every inch of his mind, Klaus understood one terrible truth. This was never just about stopping the ritual. It had always been about ensuring that history would repeat itself. He had played his part, and now the Ancient Ones had risen, and the world would never be the same again. Klaus's vision faded as the Ancient Ones fully emerged from the rift between worlds, their immense forms towering over him like gods of destruction. The air was charged with a suffocating darkness, the very fabric of reality unraveling around them. The cold that had once filled the cavern had vanished, replaced by a weighty, oppressive heat that seemed to bend the air itself. The creatures were not just in this world now. They were becoming the fabric of it. His body, though already weary from the struggle, still fought against the overwhelming force. But it was pointless. Every instinct told him to run, to escape. But Klaus knew. He knew that the moment the gate had been opened, there was no escape. The ancient beings were free, and the world as he knew it was already slipping away into a new age, a darker one. With a final surge of pain, Klaus fell to his knees, his body heavy and tired. The whispers from the entities around him grew louder, their voices now resonating in his mind, impossibly deep and filled with dread. They were not speaking to him. They were speaking to the world. It was too late. The voices melded together, a deafening chorus that rumbled in his ears, reverberating throughout his very being. You have opened the door. You are the one who brought us back. You will watch as everything you know crumbles, for you are the one who made this possible. But as Klaus's consciousness began to fade, something unexpected happened. A voice, faint and distant, cut through the overwhelming noise. You think this is the end? It wasn't the voice of the Ancient Ones. It wasn't even the voice of Olivia. This voice was different, it was human, and with it came a flicker of hope, a realization that perhaps, just perhaps, All was not lost. Klaus's mind raced as the world around him seemed to slow. His body was barely able to respond, but his thoughts sharpened, focusing on the voice. Who was it? What was happening? And then the figure appeared, standing in the midst of the chaos. It was Dr. Henriksen. "Klaus," he said, his voice filled with a quiet urgency, "you have to understand. This wasn't the plan. It wasn't meant to be like this." Klaus, his body barely able to respond, blinked at Henriksen. The words were hazy, but he could feel them in his bones. It wasn't the plan? Henriksen's expression was grim as he looked around at the chaos unfolding. The Nazis didn't know everything. They didn't understand the full extent of what they were dealing with. But they were right about one thing. The relic, the stone, it was a key, but not just any key. It was a map. Klaus's mind raced to catch up. A map? The stone? Hadn't it been the final piece of the ritual? Hadn't he sealed the fate of the world? "You opened the gate," Henriksen continued, stepping closer, though his voice had a strange calmness to it. "But you also gave us the key to close it again. There's a way out, a way to reverse this. We can still stop them." Klaus's heart surged with a final shred of hope. Could it be true? Was there a way to undo everything he had done? Was there a chance to stop the Ancient Ones from fully rising? Henriksen continued, his words growing more urgent as the creatures around them writhed in anticipation. "The stone, the shard you touched, it wasn't just part of the ritual. It's a map to where they came from. There's a place in the Arctic, a place where the relics align, where the door can be closed once and for all. But we need to go there now. You have to help me, Klaus. You're the only one who can get us to that location. You've seen it. You know the way." Klaus felt the strength return to his limbs, just for a moment. His vision cleared, and his mind sharpened as Henriksen's words took root. The relic, the map, the stone, they hadn't just been part of an ancient ritual. They were the key to unlocking both the door and the way to stop the Ancient Ones from fully emerging into their world. But there was a catch. There was always a catch. The Ancient Ones were not just powerful beings from another realm. They were everywhere now, and they would not let their gate close so easily. Henriksen's face hardened. "We don't have much time. We need to act fast." Klaus looked around at the towering, writhing figures of the Ancient Ones, their forms now blurring with the energy of the rift. They were fully here, in this world, their voices echoing through the very fabric of reality. The warping energy around them seemed to bend time and space itself. Klaus gripped Henriksen's arm. "How? How do we stop them?" Henriksen's eyes burned with determination. "We need to get to the location, the real location, the heart of the power that created the gate. Once there, we can use the map. We can reverse the ritual. We can seal the gate permanently, but only if we get there before they fully cross over." Klaus could feel the weight of the words sinking into him. It wasn't over. Not yet. The world around them was still shaking, the entities pushing closer, trying to reach out and crush them beneath the weight of their energy. But Klaus wasn't thinking about the overwhelming terror anymore. He was thinking about the final chance to close the door, to undo the damage, to stop the creatures from fully entering the world. "Then we go," Klaus said, his voice steady despite the chaos. "We go now, before it's too late." As he spoke, a blinding light filled the cavern, and the Ancient Ones shrieked in fury. The gate, their power, was already slipping out of their control, but they were not going to let go so easily. The world seemed to collapse inward again, reality itself twisting. With one final surge of energy, Klaus and Henriksen moved towards the portal, toward the location that could save the world, or doom it forever. And as they passed through the rift, Klaus had only one thought. Could this really happen? Could they truly stop the Ancient Ones before they took full control of the world? Or had they already failed? The door to their fate was now wide open. Thank you so much for following along with this intense journey. What are your thoughts on how this chapter closed? Would you like to continue or explore any different paths? Let me know.